Logical approach to the study of the scripture. The important thing about the Old Testament is that a vast amount of it is narrative. Okay, I mean the prophets, the Psalms, most of the wisdom literature are poetry, but everything else is narrative, and that's a large portion of the Old Testament. And so we want to be able to look at narrative using the techniques that literary scholars use for analysis of literature, any kind of literature. Okay, so we've got to approach a narrative as a piece of literature. Okay, we know it's God's word, but it's also a piece of writing, and so we can examine it and understand more what is being portrayed if we have an understanding of this kind of approach. So when we study a narrative, there are a variety of things that we look at, and they're all listed here. They're not in any particular order. Doesn't matter which one you do first, but they all help us get a picture of what the narrative is really telling us. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the order of the story element. Okay. Stories are made up of little pieces, and when you tell a story, you can put the pieces in any order you want to, really. So, for example, in 1 Samuel, I guess. Yeah, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, and starting in verse 14, it says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendants said to him, 'See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for somebody who can play the harp. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes upon you, and you will feel better.' So Saul said to his attendants, 'Find someone who plays well and bring him to me.' One of the servants answered, 'I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him.' Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me your son David who is with the sheep.' So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor-bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, 'Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him.' Whenever the Spirit from God came upon Saul, David would take his harp and play. Then relief would come to Saul, he would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him." That is 1 Samuel chapter 16. And it tells us that David was in Saul's presence frequently playing the harp, that Saul liked him, and that he became one of Saul's armor-bearers. This seems to suggest that Saul knew David quite well. But when we go into chapter 17, we find the whole story of Goliath, and after David has slain Goliath, in verse 55, "As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, 'Abner, whose son is that young man?' Abner replied, 'As surely as you live, O king, I don't know.' The king said, 'Find out whose son this young man is.'" Now David, in chapter 16, was playing the harp for Saul. He was one of Saul's armor-bearers, and Abner, who's the commander of the army, didn't know who he was, and Saul didn't know who he was. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Scholars have argued about this for a long time. I think the solution is very simple. I think the writer of Samuel put these story elements in the wrong order. They're not in chronological order. Okay? And why would he do that? He's got a purpose for doing that. He's not trying to deceive us, but he has a purpose for doing it. Because in chapter 16 is when we first meet David after he's been anointed king. And what we're told about him there is that he worships God. He's a worshipper. He's also a warrior. But he's a worshipper. Then in chapter 17, we see David being the warrior. So the author of the story has changed the order of the story elements for a purpose. He wants us to know that first and foremost, David is a worshipper. And secondly, he's a warrior. Okay. If he introduces the Goliath incident first, then we will meet David as a warrior first and only as a worshipper later. Clearly, when the servants say to Saul that he's a man, he plays the harp, but he's also a warrior and a brave man, the incident with Goliath has already happened. Because it's the incident with Goliath that makes David a warrior. Before that, he's just a shepherd. Okay, so the order in which the elements in the story are put together tells us something about what the author wants us to learn from the story. If it's simple chronological order, then that's normal, and there's no problem with that. They're just telling the story and they're giving us history. But if things are out of order, if the order has been changed in some obvious way, then we have to try and discern why. Why has the author changed the order here? Okay. Now, in the book of Jonah, we have an interesting thing that happens in chapter 1. In verse 10. It's in parentheses in the English version. It's not quite so obvious in the Hebrew, but it says, they knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. Now, what has happened before this in the story? The storm has come. They've cast lots to see if they can find out who's causing the storm. And it's not until verse 10 we're told that Jonah had already told them he was running away from the Lord. If he already told them he was running away from the Lord, why did they need to cast lots? Why didn't they know that Jonah was the problem? And why does the author wait till now to tell us? Why didn't he have the little conversation that Jonah had with the sailors back when it happened, before the storm? I'm going to leave you to answer those questions. But you just sort of realise when we look at the order of a story, it's important for us to see if there are any rearrangements of the story or any arrangements of the story that we think, well, that would have been interesting to know before now. I mean, why is this piece here? Why wasn't it put there? Okay. Because when we can discern why an author's put a certain piece in his story at a certain point, then we will also be able to discern a little more about why he is telling the story. What is his agenda in telling the story? Okay. So whenever you look at a narrative, any narrative, you can do this with any narrative, you can do it with the whole of the Pentateuch except for the laws, of course, with all of the historical books. You can do it with Jonah, you can do it with Ruth, you can do it with Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah. Anything that's a narrative, even the narratives at the beginning of Job, have a look at the order in which the story is told and see, are there any anomalies? Are there any things that you think, why is that there? Or actually in each piece, think, why is that piece there? Why has the author put that there? And if it's just because it's in chronological order, that's fine. Okay, we know he's telling a historical story and putting it in order. But if it seems to be out of order for some reason, then it gives us a hint at what the author's agenda is. The narrator, we call him. Okay. Any questions about that?
So, regarding this, how can we understand, in verse 10, like you said, it's already written here, right? So, how can we analyze this statement written in Jonah? How should I say? They know, Jonah already told them, right? Like he was running away from the Lord, but still later they were terrified and they asked them. So is it like when Jonah told them, they were just thinking like the normal guy or something before the storm came?
Well, that's what it seems to be suggesting, because if you notice, they become terrified when he gives them their answer in verse 9. He answered, "I'm a Hebrew and I worship the God of heaven who made the sea and the land." They're on the sea. Even the natural order of things there would be who made the land and the sea, wouldn't it? But no, he mentions the sea first. Who made the sea and the land. Now they realise, oh, he's running away from the God who made the sea. And they're terrified. Okay. But we don't know that until they make their comments. What have you done? And then the narrator decides to tell us, actually they already knew he was running away from the Lord. What they didn't know was who the Lord was. And when Jonah tells them who the Lord is, that's when they're terrified. Okay, so that is the author, by holding back that little piece of information till now, causes us to stop and go, yeah, why now? Why are they only terrified now? When he'd already told them. And why does the author hold this piece of information till now? Why didn't he just tell us about the conversation? Why didn't he include the conversation in the narrative when it happened? Okay. It seems to be emphasizing that finally these sailors find out from Jonah who this God is that he's running away from. Okay. Now you can keep looking at it because it's part of your exercise in this class. You might come up with some other inspirations about it. Think hard about it. Try writing the story as though that was in the right order, and see what difference it makes to the way, how you perceive what's happening. Okay. So if we take that little piece, and instead of having it here, we go back to let's go back to verse 3. And Jonah ran away from the Lord and he headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. The sailors asked him why he was on the boat, and he said he was running away from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and so on. If it was there, what difference would it make to the way we perceive the story? Okay. Something to keep thinking about. Okay, so now another thing that we look at is the speed of the narrative. Now this is a very it's a bit tricky. We have got no way of measuring the speed. We can't use the speedometer on a car or measuring narrative speed is something that we can't do very accurately. It's rather subjective, but we have some extremes that can help us to know. First of all, summary is very fast narrative speed. Okay. In many passages in the Bible we have statements like, and it happened sometime later. Well, the sum time might be 20 years, might be 3 months, usually we don't know. Okay? But the fact is that the writer has jumped over a large period of time very fast. Okay? In the Gospels we read 6 days later. Well, in those 6 days we have no idea what happened. And apparently it's not important to the writer's purpose. Okay? So anything that's a summary or that takes a jump in time that leaves us with no information is what we call very fast narrative speed. The narrative's gone, in 2 seconds it's covered 10 years. Okay, very fast narrative speed. At the other extreme we have what we call very slow narrative speed, and this involves description. There's a really good example of this at the beginning of the book of Esther. Starting in verse 4, chapter 1, it says, "For a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendour and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material, to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished." Now, of all the information in those verses, how much is really important? Do we really need to know that it was in the garden? Do we need to know what hangings in the garden looked like and what the pavement looked like and what the couches were like and how much they were allowed to drink? Do we need to know that? Would it make very much difference to the story if we didn't know all that? We'd still know the events that happened. So why has the narrator used this big long section just to describe? It's very slow narrative speed. Nothing is happening. Okay? The narrative is going on, but no action is happening. Okay? This we call slow narrative speed. Slow narrative speed tells us the author is trying to emphasize something. When you slow the narrative right down, it's like, okay, so why are we being told all this? Why is this important? It has 2 effects. One is emphasis, and the other effect is it creates suspense. Okay? Another place it happens is in chapter 2, where Esther is taken to the king's palace, and you kind of know because she's singled out by name, and that she's a Jew, she's a part of a Jewish story. You kind of know something important is going to happen. But instead of being told at the beginning of chapter 2 that she becomes the queen, we have this whole story about how every one of the girls was given whatever she wanted, and she was called to the king, and she spent the night with the king, and then she went back to the harem of the concubines, and she had all sorts of treatments for 6 months of this and 6 months of that, and it tells us a whole lot of stuff that in many ways doesn't really matter to the story. It creates suspense, so that by the end of reading all this stuff we're going, well, why on earth is Esther there? Until finally it tells us that she pleased the king and she became the queen. Okay? So when you see a very slow narrative speed, when you see a long description of something that's not really necessary to the actual events in the story, then you need to ask this question: what is the author emphasizing, or what is he holding us back from to create suspense? What is he not willing to say yet? What is the thing that is going to surprise us? So we have slow narrative, fast narrative speed when we have summary, slow narrative speed when we have description like this, and then in between we have direct speech, where the narrative and the events in the narratives are happening at the same time because the person is speaking. Okay. And direct speech tells us these things are things that what is said in the direct speech is an important part of the story. The narrator actually wants to record direct speech. Okay. He doesn't just summarize what the person said. He records their actual speech. Okay. So the differences, the variations in speed in a story are what tell us, kind of subconsciously, they tell us what things are important and what things aren't really important to the writer. Okay. And sometimes we just pick them up subconsciously too. Even as we read the story, our minds kind of discern what is important, what is not to the writer. But if we're analysing a narrative, we need to be more intentional about it. We need to look at the variations in speed and see, well, what effect does this variation in speed have? Why does the author jump over those years and then explain these ones in detail? When we look at Abraham's life, I mean, Abraham lived for well over 100 years. Okay. But we don't have 100 years of detail of his life. We don't know what happened in every day of his life. We only know the things that are significant for understanding God and faith in God and how God worked to choose Abraham. Okay. So the variations in a narrative speed will help us to see what things are important to the author and to have a better understanding of what the story is actually telling us. Understand? Some questions? I should say, no one of these things will tell us the whole story. But when we start putting them together, when we look at these different aspects and we put together the effects they have, then we get a much better picture of what the story is really telling us. It's not just about the events in the story, but why is the writer organised it the way he has.
So in this case, how can we distinguish because the authors has different emphasis and maybe use different order, not according to chronological order. And another one, as a reader, how can we distinguish? Oh, this is maybe just one author, and maybe it's two authors or even more authors. They put together the book 7 do. So how to?
The overall structure of the story generally, like for example in the book of Jonah, the overall structure of the story really tells us there's only one author, because the story is actually very well organised. Okay, we looked at that order the other day and we saw that, you know, it goes through 3 different things and then it kind of goes through those 3 different things again. So it seems to suggest that there's only one author to this book. Okay. Now, mostly we can discern bigger structures than just the narrative we're looking at. I mean, in this case the book's only short, so we've really got the structure just of this book. But I mean, if you're looking at an extended narrative, say like Genesis, then you can see an overall structure to the book that indicates that the author of the book, there's only one author to this book. Okay, but the author is emphasizing some things and de-emphasizing other things. He's put the elements in a certain kind of order. Why has he used that order? So to analyse the whole narrative, we need to look at these things in detail and think carefully about them. This is not about just reading the story and going, oh, that's a nice story, or, oh, God wants us to go to Nineveh, or, but to really in-depth analyse a particular narrative and see what elements in it have the effect on us when we read it.
So like Jonah may be much simple because this is the one source is the story of Jonah. Like the Chronicles or the Kings, because the sources has multiple sources. How can we know? Oh, this whole book is written by one. He get a lot of sources, or written by several people, or edited by.
The biblical narrators are usually fairly honest. So in Chronicles, the writer tells us that he borrowed. He tells us he got things from other sources. Now actually that's very helpful because we can look and say, well, why did he choose that bit? In Chronicles, for example, the writer of Chronicles uses lots and lots of speeches that are not found in the parallel record in Kings. He uses lots of lists. So that gives us, when we analyse those kind of things, we see, oh, so he used a written source for this. Did he use that source because that's the only way he knew about that event, or did he use that source because it was convenient, it was already written down, or did he use that source because that source says something that he wanted us to know? Okay. Now we can't always discern, sometimes this is quite subjective obviously, but it helps us when we look at a narrative to look at it at the way it's been constructed, basically, because the way it has been constructed, even if it's using other written sources, and apparently there were different authors, but the final person, the editor who's put it together, has used them in various ways, that tells us about his purpose. Okay, why he's chosen certain things and not chosen other things. Why does the writer of Chronicles choose to tell us about David's numbering of Israel, but he doesn't tell us about David's sin with Bathsheba? And why does the writer of Kings tell us about David's sin with Bathsheba, but he doesn't make such a fuss about David's numbering of Israel? Okay. Why does an author leave out some things we know from a parallel account? And why does he include some things that weren't in that parallel account? What does the comparison tell us about the different agendas of the two authors? Now it's easiest to do when you've got two parallel accounts, obviously. We compare Kings with Chronicles. We can discern these differences and get an idea that the writer of Chronicles had a different agenda than the writer of Kings. But even when we've only got a single narrative, looking at these particular elements will help us to get a better, clearer understanding of what seems to be the author's purpose. After all, what we want when we analyse a narrative is to know what is the author's purpose. What is the message they want us to get? And how have they constructed their story so that that message comes through?
So like the television series, maybe first they have 4 seasons, and the 5th season they change the directors or the scriptwriters. I mean, suppose like in China we have a very famous novel. Just the first 80 chapters was written by the original writer, and we have the additional 40 chapters is added, which added by another person who wrote it, and we see the two authors are very different. This is also, I think, also applies like the book of Mark. The last several passages. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's added by the next version. So how how can we discredit? I mean, to discern which one is original and which one is late addition.
I think the point that we have to understand is that if we believe that the Bible as it is the inspired word of God, then the final form of the story is God's message. And it doesn't actually matter who wrote the bits or how they differ unless we can discern what is the message of the final form. Okay. So whoever put it together, if the last person to make additions or whatever put it together in a certain way, then what effect does the way they've put it together have on the message that we receive? Because that message is the message God wants us to have.
So in this case, like, because we know the four Gospels, there's no, what's written anonymous, no specific authors held in the Gospel per se. So is anything like God purposely do this because God wants the readers focus on the character of Jesus, not the author? Well, maybe we, as a Christian, we want to, as a human nature, we want to try to know the author, want to dig out who is the author. In this case, maybe we just kind of misunderstand God's purpose.
But knowing who the author is doesn't really make any difference to our understanding of the whole message, because we believe that the author is inspired by the Holy Spirit. So ultimately the author is actually the Holy Spirit. Okay, now he uses human personality, and human beings all write with different styles. God knows what's in a human being and why they will write with a certain style, and he chooses them to write because of who they are and the way they will express it. The way it's expressed in the Word gives the message that God wants to give. And so that's why when we look at a narrative like this, we want to look carefully at the way it is expressed, how it's been put together by whoever was the last person to touch it. You know, the last one to finish off the work, whatever it is. Because that is the message that God has for us. Okay. And the human author is not important, except that when their personality shows through, we see their personality revealing something of God's personality. Like with Hosea and his desperate love for an unfaithful wife. Okay, so his personality shows through his writings, his personal experience shows through his writings, but there's a purpose for that, is to show us that is God and God's love for his people. Okay, that he is the desperate lover of an unfaithful wife. And it's out of that desperation that he gives these messages for Hosea to express. So when we look at these kind of approaches to a narrative, they help us to get a better grip on what is really happening and what is the real message of the narrative. The writer of all of the whoever wrote the narratives in all of the Old Testament was writing for a purpose. Okay. And yes, they're recording history, but they're writing history with a theological purpose. Okay. So these things help us to kind of slow down our reading and not just read the story, but to analyze the story as we read it, to help us get a clearer understanding of what is the story telling us. Okay. Now, just because I'm calling it a story or a narrative doesn't mean it's not history. Okay. We can accept that it's history, but that the person has recorded history in a specific way. And those two, order, story element, narrative speed, often give us some clues into the reason why the person is writing it, what it emphasizes. Okay. Another thing we look at is called perspective by some authors, others call it point of view, others call it focus. Okay, when you're reading a story, whose eyes are you looking through? Now, most of the time, the person telling the story is what we call the biblical narrator. Okay? He's just telling a story. But sometimes in the story, people speak. And what they say is not what the biblical narrator is saying, it's their own perspective. Okay. Now, I can show you a very clear example of this at the beginning of Esther. In chapter 1, the king calls Vashti to come, and she doesn't come. Okay, so one man speaks to one woman, and the one woman says no. Okay. Memucan, in verse 16, replies, in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Okay. He says because one woman said no to one man, now all the women in the kingdom are just going to rebel against their husbands. That's what he thinks. That's his perspective. Okay. Is it really going to happen? Probably not. So if a person is speaking, what they're saying is their point of view. And we have to discern, are they telling the truth or are they telling a lie? Because the scripture faithfully records the lies people tell. There's a classic example of a lie at the end of 1 Samuel. Beginning of 2 Samuel actually. At the last chapter of 1 Samuel, we read in verse 14, chapter 31, verse 4, Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me. But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. That is the biblical narrator telling us that piece of information. Okay. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So the author, the narrator, who is always considered reliable and truthful, he tells us that Saul committed suicide, and so did his armor bearer. Okay. Now, when we go to 2 Samuel, chapter 1, verse 2, on the third day a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn, with dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honour. Where have you come from? David asked him. He answered, I have escaped from the Israelite camp. What happened? David asked. Tell me. He said, the men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, the man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, what can I do? He asked me, who are you? An Amalekite, I answered. Then he said to me, stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive. So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord. That's all his speech. That's not the narrator telling the story. That is all his speech. And it's all a lie. And he paid for it with his life. Because David had him killed. Because he had killed Saul. Okay. So, when we're reading a narrative, first of all we've got to understand if somebody is speaking, what they're saying is their idea. It's their perspective on a situation. It's not God's point of view. That's the point of view of the person who is speaking. Okay? But there are other little markers that we have that tell us that there's been a change in perspective. You know, in television or films or whatever, you know, you see a wide panorama and then you see a narrow focus on something and then it changes to a different... This is what we're talking about, this idea of focus or perspective. And if you can imagine the narrative as it's being told, if you can imagine what it would look like in a movie scene, it will help you see when a perspective changes. Okay. In Hebrew, there's a little marker word that helps us to see a change of perspective. It's the little word hine, which we usually translate behold. And what it usually tells us is that now we're seeing something through the eyes of a person in the story, not necessarily through the narrator's eye. Okay? So Jacob comes to the well and behold, he sees the flocks gathered and they're not drinking. Why not? Okay? Then that tells us that actually the perspective has changed. The narrator is not looking down from above and telling us everything that's happened. He's now looking through Jacob's eyes and telling us what Jacob sees. There's a change in perspective. Okay. And the different changes in perspective also show us things that are important to the author, okay, or the narrator. So this whole speech of Memucan's, which takes up quite a lot of chapter 1 in Esther, is Memucan's perspective. Okay. It's interesting that Haman has the same perspective later in the book, when one man refuses to bow down to him, and then he tells the king that the whole race of people don't obey the king's laws. It's a complete exaggeration, but it's Haman's perspective. Okay. So discerning who's telling us this information is an important part of understanding the message of the book. The narrator, what the narrator tells us is always trustworthy, and the narrator knows everything. Okay. He's omniscient. He also seems to be omnipresent. Okay. But the human beings in the story don't know everything. And something that creates irony, which we'll talk about at the end, is when the people in the story are ignorant about things that the readers know about. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Anyway, the perspective. Who's telling us? Whose eyes are we looking through when we read this part of the story? Okay. Again, what I've said is any one of these things don't give you the whole picture, but when you look at each one of these things together, then you get a picture, a fuller picture of what's really the message of the book. Okay. So the next one is repetition. Now, for a long time, scholars, especially Old Testament scholars, especially the Pentateuch, they took any repetition as evidence that two stories have somehow been spliced together by a redactor, and that if something's repeated, it's because they weren't very good at putting together their stories, which seems to be a bit insulting about the ability of the redactors to actually produce a good story. Nowadays, when we talk about narrative and repetition in a narrative, we're looking at emphasis. When the narrator has something repeated, we should pay attention. Why is that repeated? The normal number of repetitions in biblical narrative, Robert Alter tells us this, is 3. The narrator will tell us something. A person in the story will repeat it, sometimes with a slight variation, which tells us their perspective is a little different. And then the narrator will repeat it again to confirm what it was he originally said. Okay? So the normal number of repetitions is 3, if anything that's particularly important. There's a particular repetition in the book of Esther which breaks those rules dramatically. It's in Esther chapter 6. In chapter 6, verse 6, the king asked Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honour? Okay, this is a question, but it uses those words, for the man the king delights to honour, once. Okay. Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honour than me? Actually, the Hebrew is much closer to the first statement. It says, for the man whom the king delights to honour. In the Hebrew, Haman's statement is, who would the king delight to honour more than me? So that's the second repetition, but the first one is the king saying, the second one is Haman saying it. Okay? So in verse 6, he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honour. Third time we've read that. Now it's Haman again. This is the king, this is Haman, this is Haman. Have him bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden on with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour. Haman again. And lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king delights to honour. Go at once, the king commanded. Haman, get the robe and the horse. Do as you have suggested for Mordecai the king, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king delights to honour. 6 times that statement is used. This breaks that rule dramatically. 3 times is normal. Here we have a statement repeated 6 times. The first time by the king and 5 more times by Haman. Why? Why is it repeated so often? Who's repeating it? And from this one we find out he thinks it's him. He likes the idea of being the man whom the king delights to honour. Okay? And that's what makes this so funny, because for these 4 repetitions he thinks he's talking about himself. And it's not till the last one that he's found out that he's not talking about himself at all. Okay? This makes this really very, very funny. But there's this repetition that it breaks all the rules. I mean, it's extreme. And so it tells us that Haman's really, really sure that he is that one. Other repetitions will show us when somebody has misinterpreted what God has said. So the narrator may tell us what God has said, and then another person speaks. That's why when I said, God tells Jonah to preach the message he will give him. We're never told what that message is. And then Jonah preaches a message that has no if clause in it. Are we sure that is God's message? We're never told what God's message actually was. Okay. Now there's no repetition in that particular part of the story, because God doesn't say a message that Jonah repeats misinterpreted. Okay? But in other places we have this kind of thing that happens. God gives a message, or the narrator tells us something, then a person in the story repeats it but with some variation, and that tells us that's their perspective, and that what they've done is they've either misinterpreted or they've seen it they're seeing it from a different perspective than the reliable narrator. And then usually there's another repetition from the narrator to correct that misconception. Okay, so repetition is generally for emphasis. Okay, but it also reveals something to us about the people in the story, whether they have really got the message or whether they've distorted it in some way. Okay. So don't just think that repetitions are accidents. When an author incorporates a repetition, it's because there's something important, either about the actual words themselves or sometimes about what comes in between them. In the book of Judges we have something that's repeated at least 3 times. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes. When it's repeated, sometimes it's a whole chapter after. What is in between that? What is in between those 2 repetitions? The author is they're like bookends. They're focusing us on what's in between those 2 things. Okay? And in those chapters of Judges, that's where we read about civil wars and men having homosexual desires and rape and murder, and those statements come at the end of the book of Judges in the last 3 or 4 chapters, and in between those repetitions we have all of this horrific stuff that happens that shows us that when everybody does what's right in their own eyes, all sorts of chaos happens. So any repetition, when you pick up a repetition, have a look at it. Why is it there? Is this the statement itself being emphasized by the author? Is somebody in the story misunderstanding that statement? Is it repeated because it's the beginning and end of an incident, and the incident itself is to be emphasized because it's been kind of put between these 2 statements? Okay. So there are impacts that repetition have. In this case, they just make for a hilariously funny story. Okay. Direct speech. People who actually speak in the stories are usually important. Okay. The people who speak most are the most important. And people who don't speak at all are generally not important at all. Okay. So we want to look at the direct speech and see who's speaking the most. That will give us an idea of who's really important in the story. In the book of Esther, the king speaks the most, but Esther is the second. Whose is the second most speech? Okay. That tells us that Esther is actually an important person in this story, which goes right against what most preachers want to say about the book of Esther, who say that Mordecai is the important person. the amount of direct speech given to Esther tells us Esther is the important person. The king and Esther are the important people. But it's not only just looking at how much they say, but what kind of things do they say? Who asks the questions? Who answers the questions? Are they questions or are they just statements? What a person says tells us something about that person. Okay? And we get a certain impression about a person from the things they say. Okay? When you analyse the speeches at the end of Jonah, we get a very clear picture of Jonah from the things he says, don't we? I'm really angry enough to die. And we get a very clear picture of Jonah from what he says. In the book of Esther, the king speaks 17 times. 15 of his speeches are questions. Yeah, isn't that interesting? He is in charge of the whole Persian Empire from India to Ethiopia, but 15 of his speeches, that's well over half. It's almost all of his speeches are questions. So, when we read that book and we actually analyse that and see, hello, this man is supposed to be in charge of the whole province of the whole of the Persian Empire from India to Ethiopia, and he hasn't got a clue what's going on. He's always asking questions. And the 2 times he speaks that are not questions are both fatal. One is when Haman says, there's people we should get rid of, and he doesn't ask, who are they? He just says, go ahead and do it. And then the second time, when Harbona says there's a gallows outside that Haman made for Mordecai, he says, hang him on it. Not because Haman was trying to kill all the Jews, but because he thought Haman was trying to rape his wife. So the whole impact of all of his speeches just give us the impression that this man is an idiot. He doesn't know what's going on. He asks questions all the time, and the only times he doesn't ask questions is when he makes big mistakes. And I'm sure the author of the book of Esther wanted him portrayed like that. That's how they wanted you to see him. He's foolish. There's also repetitions that go with this kind of thing too, because another thing that happens in the book of Esther is the law of the Meads and the Persians. There's laws for everything. There's the laws about how to drink in the first chapter. There's the law about who can approach the king in the second chapter. There's the law about how the women are supposed to be purified in the second chapter. There's laws for everything. And the word for law is always the Persian word for law. It's not the Hebrew word for law. It's not Torah. Okay? So it shows us that the writer of the book thinks Persian law is stupid. Because you can't change it. You can't change it. Even the king himself is unable to change it. Okay? And quite apart from that, with all the law in the book, in the end there's no justice. Haman is killed not because he was trying to destroy all the Jews, but because the king thought he was trying to rape Esther. That's why he was killed. That's not justice. And the people who break the laws, Mordecai, and Esther are the people who bring about justice. So when we see these things together, repetition, direct speech, and analyse who's speaking, what are they saying? Do they know what's going on? Are they asking questions or are they giving answers? Then we get a picture of what the narrator is trying to portray in these people. Okay. I'm sure that King Ahasuerus says lots more than the things that are recorded in the book of Esther. But the writer doesn't record any of the other things he says. He chooses to record all the questions. So looking at what people say and how they say it, whether they're making statements or asking questions, is a very important part of analysing the whole narrative. Verb forms are also important, obviously. We want to know if it's a causative, if it's a reflexive, if it's an ongoing action that's not come to an end, if it's a participle. There are a variety of things that tell us, that verb forms actually give us. Walkie and O'Connor have a list of the normal incidents of specific verb forms in a Hebrew narrative. Okay. And they tell us, have you all studied Hebrew? Of course you have. This is Hebrew exegesis. What am I talking about? They tell us if we take nifals, puals, hofals, and cal passive participles all together, those four verb forms, they're all passives. Those four verb forms normally occur 7% of the time. 7% of the verbs in a Hebrew narrative will be passive. There'll be one of those four. Nifal, pual, hofal, or cal passives. Okay, 7%. That's normal. In the book of Esther, 15% of the verbs are passives. It's normal for 7% of verbs to be passives. In the book of Esther, 15% are passives. What is going on there? Why would a narrator more than double the usage of passive verbs? That's not an accident. And that's because passives do two things. When we use a passive verb, the subject of the verb is being acted on by someone else. Okay. So passive verbs in the book of Esther tell us there's somebody acting on the subjects. Okay, the somebody is never mentioned. So passive verbs, this is a recognised thing in Greek actually. There's a thing called a divine passive in Greek. Nobody's ever identified it in Hebrew, but I think this is the same thing. It's a passive verb that's used to suggest God acting without mentioning God. The subject of the verb is being acted on by somebody. Okay. But passives also do something else. They remove responsibility from the person. And I'll show you what I mean by this. In Esther chapter 2, wow, this is a really bad translation. Bother. The NIV puts it this way: later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done. And then it says, and what he had decreed about her. But that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew uses a passive verb, and it says, and what had been done to her. King Xerxes is thinking about Vashti. Remember what she did, and what had been done to her. Hello, who did it? He did. Yeah. Now the English here has jumped through a whole lot of hoops and changed it and made it sound as though he's thinking about the fact that he decreed this, but it's not how the Hebrew. It says, it uses a passive verb. It uses asa in the nifal. What had been done to her, as though he was not responsible for it. Okay. And there are a couple of other places. What had been written about the Jews, as though the king is not responsible for what had been written. Okay. So there are two things that passive verbs particularly do. They can show us somebody acting who's not present. In other words, they can suggest God acting. Okay. But also they can remove responsibility from a person, as though they weren't the one who did it. So analysing the verb forms and looking at how they're used. Also that verb chart, that chart in Walken O'Connor gives the specific incidents of all, like the general, in a normal Hebrew narrative, how many of the verbs are kal. Well, if you've read enough Hebrew, you know that most of the verbs are kal, actually. Okay. But there are general percentages that you can check in that chart, and if you notice a lot of forms that are not kal, have a look and see what is the percentage of verbs in the whole passage, how many of them say a hofal, and if there's, say, you look and you go, oh, well, 5% of the verbs are hofal. Is that normal? You can look in Walken O'Connor in their chart and they will tell you what percentage of verbs are normally hofal. Okay. If the narrator has used more verb forms of a certain form than a normal, then maybe there's some reason for that. Why have they gone away from the normal? Okay. I'm going to leap into a New Testament passage because this is one of my pet peeves, and so I'm just going to show you how verb forms can make a big difference to how you interpret a passage. In Ephesians chapter 4, chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to start in verse 17. It says, therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead be filled with the Spirit. Do not get drunk on wine as a negative command. It's a prohibition. Instead be filled with the Spirit as an imperative. That's a command. Be filled with the Spirit. Then the English version that I have here goes on in verse 19 as though all of these words are also imperatives, but they're not, they're participles. So he says, be filled with the Spirit, command. Then what literally it says is speaking to one another with psalms, hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of fear, out of reverence for Christ. Wives, to your husbands as to the Lord. Verses 21 and 22 are one sentence. You can't break them in the Greek. The verb submit is not in verse 22. The command is be filled with the Spirit. The rest of this passage shows us evidence of being filled with the Spirit. If you're filled with the Spirit, you will be speaking to one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. You will be singing and making music in your heart to the Lord. You will always be giving thanks to God the Father and for everything in the name of Jesus. You will be submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, to your husbands as unto the Lord. Not just wives to your husbands, actually, to one another, but with an emphasis on wives. Okay. The next command is, husbands, love your wives. That is a command. As Christ loved the church. Well, how did Christ love the church? Well, he actually died for it. Now, when you look at the verb forms, you get a very different picture of what that passage is saying. Now, included in there is the idea that wives should submit to their husbands, but it also includes the idea that husbands should submit to their wives. And that actually, that mutual submission is evidence of being filled with the Spirit. It's not a command. It's an evidence that you have fulfilled the command, which is be filled with the Spirit. So when we look at verb forms, the same thing applies in the Old Testament course in Hebrew. When we look at the verb forms, we have to be sure that we're actually really being, faithfully interpreting what the verb form really says. And we've got to remember, Hiphils are causatives, imperatives are command, jussives are encouragements to one another, and so on. That we have to remember what kind of expression is this. Nifals are both passive and sometimes reflexive. And we have to know, is it a reflexive use of this passive, of this nifal, or is it a passive, a true passive? Okay. Hitpails are reflexive. Okay, the hitpail expresses something somebody's doing to themselves. Okay. So we have to remember those functions of the different forms of verbs and be sure that we've faithfully recorded what the verb form is really telling us. Okay. I always say, this is a pun on words in English, but I always say all of the action in Hebrew is in the verbs. That's a pun because verbs are action words anyway, but in Hebrew everything hinges on the verbs. Nouns and pronouns and adjectives, they don't change form very much. You have masculine, singular, masculine, feminine, singular and plural, and there's not big changes in all of those other words, but the verbs are really the essence of the language, and they tell you what's going on. So really all of the action in Hebrew is in the verbs. And knowing what forms are used, if they're commands or if they're participles or if they're prefix, which means the action is incomplete, or if they're affix, which means the action is complete, or then if they've got conversives or reversives on them that changes things around. The verbs are really the essence, and it's very important when you are analysing a narrative to be sure that you have faithfully recorded what the verbs are really saying. Check on them all and see if the writer is using a normal number of specific forms of verbs, or if he's got more or less, and so on.
Can I ask one question regarding justified? Like Usually what we learn is like it doesn't come with verb conversive. So verb, even though verb is attached, but I think the letters are shortened, like it's not like complete form.
If it's a weak verb, it will be the shortened form. Sometimes adjussive occurs on a verb that's not a weak verb, and it won't be shortened. Okay. Deciding whether a verb is adjussive or not doesn't only depend on its form; it depends on the context.
So, for example, I just started doing parsing for chapter 1. So I was a little bit confused because that's my confusion. Like sometimes it can be sound like Joseph also, like Sata in here it's written, especially in verse 14 we have Nathan. So Nathan is like the noon is assimilated. So it appears with another features also with Makif together. So can it be also adjustive form because it's second person masculine singular? But that one is shortened.
Chapter 1 verse
14.
You've got another clue there. You've got al. Al is always it's a negative. It's either a negative imperative or a negative adjussive. Always. Okay, so when al occurs, the verb following it must be imperative or adjussive or cooperative.
So we can choose based on the context, like which we want to put here.
Yeah.
Because usually we learn like particle na that appears together with adjussive and cooperative form.
Can do, but al as a negative is always on one of those forms, imperative, adjussive or cooperative. If it's a normal form of a verb like a prefix or an affix, then it will have lo for the negative. Okay, so al is nearly always an indication that it's adjussive or an imperative. If you parse a verb as adjussive, if you didn't notice it was adjussive and you parsed it as a prefix, that's fine because the form is always prefix. Okay, there may be a shortened form, but it's still a prefix form. So if you didn't notice it was adjussive, that's okay to call it a prefix. But do be discerning about this because sometimes it does make a difference. And when there's an al, then it's clearly adjussive. Okay. Oh, this is PDF file. So actually, I have to change that in my word form because it's definitely just. Okay, so that brings us to the whole subject of irony, and this is something I referred to earlier. In dramatic irony occurs when the people in the story are ignorant of some things that the readers already know. irony. So, to go back to Esther chapter 6, when you read the story, you know that Haman wants to hang Mordecai. And you also know that the king wants to honour Mordecai. But at the beginning of chapter 6, we have this connection between the king and Haman, and the king does not know what we know. The king does not know that Haman wants to hang Mordecai.
Yeah.
And then Haman does not know what we know. We know the king wants to honour Mordecai, and Haman doesn't know that. So the reader has two pieces of information that the two people in the story do not have. And that's what makes it so funny. We know the king wants to honour Mordecai. We also know Haman wants to hang him. And then there's this conversation between the two of them about honouring the man the king wants to honour. And that's what creates this irony, this fact that we know stuff that the people in the story don't know, they're ignorant of. Okay? And that's what irony is actually an important part of a lot of Hebrew writing. I think one of the reasons why many people don't understand the Old Testament, and one of the reasons why, for example, people think the book of Esther shouldn't be in the Old Testament, is that they don't understand Hebrew humour. The book of Jonah, the book of Esther, these are probably two of the funniest stories in the whole Bible. They're supposed to be funny. You're supposed to laugh. Okay? Hebrew humour is ironic. It's kind of satirical. Well, for example, how stupid is it for somebody to attack the Jews? The Jews are the apple of God's eye. So the silliest person in the story of Esther is Haman. King comes a close second. You know, that still, I think, even in modern Hebrew, in modern Israel, there's this whole attitude that you can't take seriously people who want to wipe you out because you're God's people. There was a modern movie made I'm not sure of the exact name of it now. It was something like Life is Wonderful. It was about an Italian Jewish family who were taken to a concentration camp during World War II, and the father, he had a little boy just like 4 or 5 years old, and the father played this game with the boy. Always he said that they were playing a game, and their team, in order to win the game, they had to do certain things, but in the end of the game, the prize for the team that won would be to ride in an American tank with an American Army commander. And so he got his son, it's based on a true story, he got his son through, I think it was something like 4 years in a concentration camp in World War II by pretending that these people who were, these Nazis who were guarding them were not serious. That this was all just part of the game. It was just a game. And the little boy, I mean, the story is told from the perspective of the little boy, but after he's grown up, and he tells the whole story, and he says that he didn't actually know, he didn't know the war was on. He didn't know that they were in danger. He didn't know that they were, you know, that they could die. He just spent the whole war believing that they were playing this big game that they would win. Now, and that is a very Hebrew perspective on life. That I was saying to my Old Testament theology class this morning, one of the things that scholars mention about what marks Israelites out, especially in their time in the wilderness, what marks them out against the other nations around about them is their joy. Now, if you read the Pentateuch, you don't get the impression that they're terribly happy people. They seem to be grumbling all the time. But actually, a real Hebrew attitude to life is an attitude of great joy. Joy that God has given them His law, joy that they're His people, joy that He's chosen them. And that's why we have these narratives like Jonah and Esther and other books that they're not supposed to be taken seriously. They're supposed to show us that life is really a big laugh. That even when really awful things seem to be happening, that the God who is our Father is still in control and that we can trust Him. And how much more should we have that attitude as Christians? And that's a Jewish attitude to life, then Christian attitude to life can be multiplied. The joy of the Lord is our strength. That statement comes from Nehemiah. It's an Old Testament statement. The joy of the Lord. So don't miss the irony in the text. They are supposed to be funny sometimes. Even maybe a little sarcastic sometimes. The book of Esther is really quite sarcastic about Persian war. Okay, so when we analyse a narrative, we need to see where is the author actually making fun? Or has he written something that causes us to laugh? The last chapter of Jonah is very amusing. To think of Jonah sitting out there under a plant, all grumpy, angry at God, waiting for Nineveh to perish. You can't help smiling at Jonah. He's kind of ridiculous. But then when God asks the final question, you realise Jonah is us. So all of these things together are important ways of analysing a narrative. And when you write your exegesis paper, I want to see in your exegesis paper that you have looked at some of these things. That in the passage you're looking at, you've analysed, is there any of this here? Is there out of order story elements? What is there changing narrative speed? Whose perspective are we looking at? Indicate that you have actually applied some of these things to the passage that you're looking at, and see what difference it makes to how you read it, how you understand what's actually happening in the passage. Okay. Any further questions?
So, yesterday when we took the Torah and the Pentecost and the professor author, he says the cognitive it's kind of like he thinks the language shapes your thoughts. That means something cannot be translated in this particular language, written in this particular language, maybe cannot be totally translated in another languages. Also, even the way of your thinking is also defined by your culture or the language you're speaking. So, like Nadia said, the Hebrew, the most important thing, the essence is the verb, and there's very few passive tense, not like English, because like the academic writings usually most of the time use the passive, or it's more, the passive seems more objective. So, I mean, from this perspective, like God chose the Hebrew language to reveal Him, but this language is more emphasized on verb. Is there any significance in this?
I think there is. I think God, you're right, God chose Hebrew for the Old Testament to be written in. He chose Greek for the New Testament. He chose the language, not just the people, but the language, because of the way the language expresses things. And that, after all, is why we study Hebrew, because although we know we have translations, the translations don't necessarily do justice to the message. They're reliable translations, they do their best, but it's really not possible to say exactly the same thing in another language. And that is why we learn Hebrew. I mean, the Hebrew word chesed, in many ways you can't express it in English, because it covers such a wide range of English words. It covers the idea of grace, of mercy, of favour, of love, of compassion. It's kind of got all of those ideas wrapped up in this one Hebrew word. So it's translated into English into loving kindness. It's the best we can do, but it's a really big word. And so that's why it's important for us to know what's the original word, what is translated here, what is the Hebrew word that's behind this English or Chinese or Tagalog or Nepali translation. What is the Hebrew word that's behind it? In the passages in Elijah on the Mount Carmel, you translated that, chapter 19. In Hebrew 3, you must have translated that. 1 Kings 19.
I think that's the very first.
Yeah, I think it's one of your early translations in Hebrew 3. Yeah. The English versions, they just make it very polite. They try hard not to be offensive. Let's find it. 1 Kings 19. No, it's 18. It's 18, sorry. It's where he confronts the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Okay. And the prophets of Baal have taken the bull and given them, they prepared it, and call on the name of Baal from morning till noon, and they dance around the altar, etc. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said, surely he's a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. Now, okay, we understand that Elijah is mocking them, but the English translations have translated this. They've cleaned it up. Because what Elijah actually says is, perhaps he is peeing or pooing, is really what he says. Perhaps he's defecating or urinating. Okay. Now, I know the Nepali version is the only one that actually translates that well. All the other all the other language versions I know of kind of clean it up. They can't say what Elijah really says. It's like it's such impolite language that in English we say he's deep in thought or busy. It's like a euphemism, you know. I don't know what they do with Tagalog, I'm not sure, or with Chinese, but it's like, because this is Elijah speaking, and Elijah is a great prophet of God, he couldn't possibly be using those words. They're very impolite words. They're rude. And Elijah's being rude. He's being rude on purpose. He's talking about Baal. Okay. Sometimes the translator's own culture forces them to express something in a way that's not exactly what the Hebrew is saying. And that's why I think that whole thing that we looked at the verb forms in Ephesians, English translators from our own cultural perspective, and most of the translators are male, have put English culture in there. That's not exactly what those verses are saying. And so, you know, translators do their best to express fairly what the original writers were saying, but sometimes their own culture will blind them to, or make it impossible for them to say exactly what is there. English culture finds it very difficult to talk about toilet things, so we use euphemisms. And that's why in this passage it doesn't come out as clearly as it would. You know, I mean, the closest we could probably get in English without feeling very uncomfortable would be to say that perhaps he's in the toilet. And even that's more polite than what Elijah's really saying. So that is the whole reason why we did Hebrew. So we will get, not only know exactly what the words are, but we will get a feeling and understanding of Hebrew culture. Because God revealed himself in Hebrew culture. And I want to tell you, Hebrew culture is much closer to your culture than it is to mine. My culture is based on Greek culture. Your cultures are Asian, and Hebrew culture is Asian. So your culture is much closer to Hebrew culture. Therefore, your understanding of what is here can be actually culturally better informed than a Western culture can be. You should be excellent Hebrew scholars because culturally you're closer.
Actually, the same verse in our language is also translated like, maybe your God has fallen asleep.
The falling asleep part is there. That's true. That is, in English, the words here that it says, perhaps there's deep in thought or busy. Those two words there, deep in thought or busy, those are the two words that refer to the toilet activity. Okay. So the being asleep is there. Okay, that's part of the Hebrew text. But these other two words in English, these are kind of euphemisms, you know. Or they don't actually really show us what's really there. Okay. And translators are all human. So they have biases. And sometimes the bias shows in the translation. The very first English translation, Mongolian translation of the Bible, of the New Testament, the first Mongolian translation was done by a person who's anti-Pentecostal, and it shows.
Yeah, also the Chinese Bible also and Pentecostal. Robert Menzies even wrote in a paper to talk about the Chinese translation and Pentecostal.
when the Septuagint translators translated the book of Job into Greek, some of the things Job said they just left out. They didn't like them and they couldn't think of any way of changing them, so they just left them out. And there are other things where Job said something and the translator thought, it can't be that verb, it must be another one that sounds the same. So decided on the basis of personal conviction that, you know, Job couldn't possibly have said that word, so he must have said one that sounds the same. So changed, you know, 3-letter verb in Hebrew, you can change one of the letters and it changes the meaning of the verb altogether. Okay? So, I'm just trying to think. It doesn't really matter which letter you change. If you change one letter in a 3-letter verb, you've changed the verb. It means something completely different now. Okay? And so, when they translated the book of Job, there were things that Job said that they thought, no, he couldn't possibly have said that. It can't be that verb. It must be. And they would think of another Hebrew verb that had, say, 2 letters the same and one different, or one, maybe an ayin instead of an aleph, or a verb instead of a bait, so that the sound is the same but the spelling is different, and then they would translate that verb into Greek. So the Septuagint translators clearly had problems with some of the things that Job said, and so they didn't translate exactly. They thought of another word that it must be and translated that into Greek, or else they left it out. Sometimes they just left things out that Job said. There's a whole book, man did his dissertation on it back in 1949, so it's really old now, but he showed that the Septuagint translators didn't like the things that Job said, and so they either changed them or they removed them. Now that's pretty much true of the whole Septuagint actually. The Septuagint translators had a doctrinal bias. In the book of Esther, God is not mentioned in the Hebrew text, but in the Septuagint he's mentioned by a variety of names, something like 50 times. If something is a little bit ambiguous, that you're not really sure, it could mean this or it could mean that, the Septuagint translators force it into a firm meaning. They take out the ambiguity. And it's been shown in a variety. I mean, I did it myself in my dissertation on Esther, but somebody else did it on the Old Greek of what book was that he did? Can't remember which book it was now. Did a comparison of the Hebrew and the Greek and showed some. Daniel, it was the book of Daniel, that's right. Did a comparison and showed that the Greek version and the Hebrew version, what the differences were, and shows that there's bias in the Septuagint translation. We have to remember the Septuagint translators came from what we call the Second Temple period of Judaism. This is after the exile. This is when the Jews have become fanatically monotheistic and very, very legalistic. And so the Septuagint reveals these characteristics. And so after all, that's why we're studying Hebrew. No translation of this is without bias, actually. That's why it's important for you to know who are the translators and what was their What was their method of translating? Is it literal? Is it word for word? Literal translation? Or is it dynamic equivalent, where they take a concept and then make the same concept in their own language or culture? Because there are a variety of ways of translating. You need to know what is their method of translating. But see, even things like where I showed you in Esther chapter 2, where the king kind of wakes up and realises he's lost his wife. The translators have changed the idea there, and they've said, he remembered what he had decreed about her, but those words are not in the Hebrew. The Hebrew literally says what had been done to her. And that makes a difference in how you perceive what the king's really thinking. When he's thinking about what had been done to her, it's as though it wasn't him who did it. It distances itself from him. And so this translation is pretty loose. It's not very accurate. Now it might seem to express the same idea, but it doesn't really express the same idea. Because he's not thinking about what he had decreed. He's thinking about what had been done. Now, this is not so you can go through your own language and translation of the Bible and criticize the whole thing. But it is so that when you preach, you can bring out the proper meaning. That you can preach with authority, knowing what the original really says. Okay. I've heard preachers who've emphasized, it says but. It doesn't say and, it says but. And I'm like, this Hebrew, it says vav. Could be either. You can't emphasize that. You can't jump up and down on that. It's not a stable foundation. A vav can mean but, or when, or then, or and, or, it's a very fluid meaning. So when I hear people making those kind of statements when they're preaching, I know they don't know Hebrew. And they're making a mistake. When we preach from the Old Testament, we must not I've said this before to Hebrew students. Knowing the Hebrew language, being able to parse all the verbs, is kind of like wearing underwear. You're supposed to wear it, but you're not supposed to show it off. Okay? Your understanding of Hebrew and how you've studied it helps you to be sure what is really the message of this text, so you can preach with authority. But you don't have to show off the underwear. You don't have to kind of explain all the verb forms and everything. But you do have to draw the message out of the passage so that it's understandable for people in your congregation today. And they won't understand if you say this is the Hiphil third person masculine singular and it means da da da. No, they don't need to know all that detail. They need to know that you know authoritatively that this passage really gives us this message.